Victor and myself to organize this very intriguing conference. And I find it difficult to follow Florencia's very interesting talk. And I was amazed by how many similarities or places of entanglement there were between my talk and her talk. I have also one more role besides talking about, but I am going to talk about an axis, the axis that goes from shamanism through neural capitalism to the statisticon, and then I'm going to sweep around between early cognitive capitalism, late cognitive capitalism, including infotainment in that discussion. So what is the statisticon? The statisticon is a word that I made up to describe the perfect and seamless confluence of the conditions of massive data collection, epigenetic sculpting of the brain's neuroplasticity, I'll explain what that is, parametrically derived smart and sustainable architecture and urban design, the process of valorization created by communicative capitalism and the technologies of affect integrated into post-production and special effects found in film and virtual platforms. It is the latest and future stage of what Foucault called the disciplinary society, and Deleuze referred to as a society of control. In these former two conditions, externalized power systems impose control, normalization, political rationality from without, whereas through the sculpting of the neuroplastic potentiality of the brain, especially in early life, the statisticon creates subjects from within. The statisticon is the most recent stage in the process that begins with the panopticon, continues through the synopticon. It is an omniscient and omnipotent, occurring in real time and an important component of real subsumption. Real subsumption being the difference between formal subsumption. Real subsumption is that everything in life becomes work. The question I want to explore in this talk is what, if any, resistance can be mustered against the impending total subsumption of the neurobiological, mental, and existential realms. I want to, in the end, call attention to the role of psychedelic drugs and aesthetic production in its many forms, without getting romantic, in the promotion of the brain's variability at a molecular and molar level. And that's the key here, the brain's variability. It is this variability produced during conception, when the egg and the sperm come together, pregnancy, during the development of the fetus in the mother's womb, and after birth, the actual relationship of the existential reality or virtuality upon the sculpting of the neuroplasticity that I point to as the conditions of freedom and hope. Imagine, and this is what I'm kind of driving at, and this is a quote from Andy Clark. Imagine that you begin using the web at age 4. Dedicated software agents track and adapt to your emerging interests and random explorations. They then help direct your attention to new ideas, web pages, and products. Over the next 70 years, you and your software agents are locked in a complex dance of co-evolutionary change and learning, each influencing and being influenced by the other. In such a case, in the very real sense, the software entities look less like your problem-solving environment than part of you. The intelligent system that now confronts the wider world is biological you plus the software agents. These external bundles of code are contributing rather like the various subpersonal cognitive functions active in your brain. What if instead of the limited conditions of software agents connected to laptop flat screens, software agents were installed linked to interactive, smart, and designed environments and architecture, where your actions as well as your mental choices were monitored, collected as databases that created prognostic and predictive algorithms that reduced the possibility of unexpected and chance encounters. This is the key to the statisticon, which is the future condition, free of laptops and clicks of a mouse, in which every surface is web-linked and your actions are in effect searches. That this connectivity was linked to learned brainwave generating regimes. This is a screenshot, the Thingful search engine. On Thingful, you could search the Internet of Things by location, types of connected objects, and ownership. With the proliferation of such objects, we're often wirelessly connected, the Internet is becoming both and more spatially present and marked by the rise of people-to-machine and machine communication. Connected Boulevard project in Nice, France, developed with Cisco Systems 2013. This data collected on the boulevard are sent to the commuting center, the cloud on the left, before being displayed on the city dashboard figure in the center. They also feed the open data portal. Pervasive computing, according to Siemens, the proliferation of connected devices is among the consequences of the development of ubiquitous and pervasive computing. It allows objects as the bulletin boards to exchange information with mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets. And this is 2004. We're already beyond this. That was just my basic introduction. Now, please be patient with me as the answer of this first introduction and the questions that I posed there, for me to go over some of the basic definitions, which will also include neuroanatomy, physiology, pharmacokinetics, before I can address my thesis. I believe that this introduction will also be very helpful as a foundation for the rest of the conference. I incidentally studied neuroscience at Caltech. I have a medical degree, and I'm an eye surgeon as well as being an artist. So I do know what I'm talking about. The first of these uses, the term shamanism definition. There's 4 definitions. And Florencia discussed a lot of what I'm going to talk about right now, and so it's good to get repetition. The first of these uses the term to refer to anybody who contacts a spirit world while in an altered state of consciousness. 2, those who contact the spirit world while in an altered state of consciousness at the behest of others. 3, the third definition attempts to distinguish shamans from other magical religious specialists who are believed to contact spirits such as mediums and witch doctors, spiritual healers, or prophets by claiming that shamans undertake some particular technique not used by the others. This is key. Problematically, scholars advocating the third view have failed to agree on what the defining technique should be. 4, the fourth definition identified by Hutton uses shaman to refer to the indigenous religions of Siberia, where actually the first investigations of shamanism were really done, not in South America, although that's probably a white Caucasian, thinking, and neighboring parts of Asia. According to Golomit Center of Shamanic Studies, a Mongolian organization of shamans, the Evenk word shaman would more accurately be translated as priest. And then talking about some of the things that Florencia talked about, entheogen, generating the divine within, is a psychoactive substance used in religious, shamanistic, and spiritual contexts. Entheogens have been used in a ritualized context for thousands of years. The religious significance is well established in anthropological and modern studies. Examples of traditional entheogens include peyote, psilocybin, mushrooms, tobacco, cannabis, ayahuasca. This is very interesting. Some shamans observe dietary and customary restrictions, particularly to their tradition. And this is almost like the way that homeopathic or naturopathic medicine predated real medicine, because even though we know all about the various biochemical and pharmacological relations of these drugs, these shamans already knew that implicitly. These restrictions, these dietary restrictions, are more than just culture. For example, the diet followed by shamans and apprentices prior to participating in ayahuasca ceremony includes rich foods in tryptophan, a biosynthetic precursor of serotonin, which is 5-HT, which is the active component of ayahuasca and LSD, as well as avoiding foods rich in tyramine, which could induce hypertensive crisis if ingested with MAOIs, such as found in ayahuasca brews, as well as abstinence from alcohol and sex. It is these first 2 definitions which are important to us here. First, by directly altering neurochemistry and by insidiously disrupting aesthetic regimes and being components of artistic redistributions of the sensibility. This is what I'm saying, why I want to draw attention to the psychoactive drugs. First, by altering the neurochemistry directly in the brain, but then also by disrupting aesthetic regimes, which shamans and artists ingesting these drugs create these aesthetic possibilities or new possibilities that then disrupt what Jacques Rancière calls the redistribution of the sensible, which I'll get into a little deeper later. Of importance to my thesis is a refusal of a transcendental idealistic ideas of aesthetic production and their correlation as analogs, and an embracing of the concept of coupling, which is not limited to the human brain, but the animal brain as well, in the context of a world of things, thingness, and thing relations. In order to move forward this discussion, we need to retreat into the field of neuroscience in order to create a foundation upon which to understand the concepts to be elucidated. And these are the following. Neural materialism. Under neural materialism is neural anatomy, neural variability, and neuroplasticity. And 2, neuropharmacology of mind-altering drugs. And 3, neural capitalism. So now I'm going to define these 3 things. So neural materialism, neural anatomy, and neuroplasticity. So first I just want to give the basic, neuron, which is the fundamental structure of the nervous system. And it has, I don't have a pointer, but the fat area in the top there is called the body of the neuron, and inside of it, it has a nucleus, and then up there is where we have the dendrites, and then this long extension is called an axon, and there is a myelin sheath, which is the sausage-shaped expanses. And then these are different kinds of neurons that are found throughout the brain, and they all have different capabilities and capacities, and they all have different shapes. I'm not going to get into a deep discussion. I just want you to have a general a feeling for all of this, because we could be here 10 hours if we wanted to, and also you may not be that interested in this stuff. So this is important. I would like you to pay attention, because this is the heart at which the neurochemistry of the neuron is the zone of where the action is. And this top part here is called the presynapse, and this is the postsynapse, and the cleft in the middle is called the synapse. And as you can see, the vesicles, these round protuberances, are filled with neurochemicals. So that's where you would have your serotonin, or your dopamine, your norepinephrine, your acetylcholine. We're talking about serotonin and 5-HT, so that's where this would be collected, and then they are released into the cleft, and then they react with these protein molecules and cause a disruption in the potential of the postsynaptic membrane, and an electrical current goes, is exchanged. And here is a lot of different kinds of synapses. Some are what are called excitatory synapses, some are inhibitory. And then here I wanted to just show you the brain. This is the 6 layers of the brain, and these are all the different kinds of neurons. And they, through this kind of complex web, or network, if you want to use that word, there's a lot of different kinds of information that can be expressed. And this is an example here of how local congregations of, or local networks of neurons in different parts of the brain can communicate between themselves, or they can contribute between themselves. So inside, local effects and global effects. And this is all important, we'll see. Now I want to before I get into neuroplasticity and all that, I want to go over a little bit of the work that Florencia already introduced, and I'm going to do less so because of limited time, but also because there's no reason to repeat everything she said. But I'm going to just very quickly talk about what I call early cognitive capitalism and late cognitive capitalism. And the late cognitive capitalism is the more important for us here today, and it's also what I call the cognitive turn or the materialistic turn. But as Florencia already introduced to us, the cognitive capitalism really finds its roots around 1975 with the beginning of the knowledge economy in a group of Italian theorists and philosophers around Milan, Torino, and these guys, their names were Paolo Berno, Maurizio Lazzarato, Tony Negri, Franco Berardi, and then André Gortz, who I think is French, was thrown in the group. And in the early stages, they were really looking at what was the information economy going to do to labor? What was going to happen when we moved from industrial capitalism, in which the proletariat, the laborer, was situated on an assembly line, and that this assembly line contained a kind of machinic intelligence that directed these laborers. How different was that going to be when they became cognitariats or cognitive laborers? What would happen? And they looked into their crystal ball, and lo and behold, many of the things they said were correct. So as Florencia mentioned, there's this idea of precarious labor, that labor is no longer on an assembly line. We have lost, as this move into cognitive capitalism, we have lost a lot of our collectivity for our excess of connectivity. And importantly, so many different new forms of precarious labor have manifested themselves, like, for instance, internships. We don't have job security. There's no health care. The worker doesn't work a full week any longer. He's a part-time worker. And there's constant uncertainty with one's job. This is the essence of precarious labor. We're seeing that we have real subsumption. We're working 24/7, and there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Crary called 24/7. We're working all the time, and our only joy is work. And we're also working in multiple time zones. People are flying from one part of the world to another. They're on the internet talking to somebody, making a deal with somebody in Japan while they're in New York. So we're actually, and that's kind of a kind of precariousness as well. And we're all sleep deprived and exhausted. Another aspect of it is immaterial labor, that performative labor, like, for instance, public relations, and spinning. They have the spin room. You know, you hear about after the debate, they're in the spin room. They're spinning the facts. Today on CNN, you no longer have experts. You have surrogates. It's all about the spin. It's all about labor that is about communication. Another really important thing about this new kind of labor is that the end of production is not the assembly line, so that the Nike shoe, after it's made for $17 in the Philippines, and I'm not sure that's the correct value, I'm just throwing that out there as an example, by the time that it reaches Fifth Avenue in New York and is sold at the Nike store there, it's $117. The value between the 17 and the 117 is part of this immaterial labor. It's part of the spin about advertising, public relations, performative, the event, what's called the event. And that's how it develops. It valorizes. It becomes more about valorization. And here's an example of the assembly line, and here's how we work today. Here's somebody who is experiencing the anxiety of the 24/7 work week. Also, value has become valorization and breaks the link between labor time and wages. I mean, how do you quantify mental work? How do you quantify conceptual art and conceptual artists? How do you quantify his or her work in which there's a line on a piece of paper, or there's an air conditioner that's been put into a room, into a gallery? How many hours did that person think about that? How many hours did he or she consider what it meant to have that air conditioner in that room, to exchange the air? If that is the conceptual work, you can't really quantify that. And we are in an attention economy where it's really about how many eyeballs are engaged and the amount of chatter on social networks. For instance, the football matches. You're paying so much for a half a minute or a minute of advertising time, and that's related to how many people are going to be watching that game, and that's about the attention economy. And there's also a disattention economy as well. There's an economy that tries to disorient you and move you away from another product's attention economy. So, in fact, if any of you have seen the misinformation guide piece that I did here at the university, technology university, that was about what it was about. We had two exhibitions. One was the real or the official exhibition, and then we created this alternative exhibition in which people, when they first come and were assaulted by our very eager guides, one had a yellow hat and one had a red hat. They didn't know if they were going on the official or the unofficial, and whether they were going through a disattention or an attention. Anyway, in a valorization economy, there is the release from the fetishization of the factory. The work is part of real subsumption outside the workday occurring in the minds of labor. And that's the key. So in this idea of valorization, as I said, between the $17 shoe that cost it to be made, the value, that then becomes $117, where the labor is occurring is in the minds of the global cognitariat, who is now the global is the global consumer. In his or her mind, as a group, as a population, the value becomes valorized. And the value, the $17 becomes $117. It's the cognitive labor, it's the work that happens in the material brain that is in cognitive capitalism, in which the brain and the mind are the new factories of the 21st century, becomes the true value or valorized value. And again, the perfect consumer in cognitive capitalism through unpaid mental labor, because we're all on Facebook and we're all on Google and we're doing unpaid mental labor by doing our searches. It's not only what we're searching, what we're buying, what Amazon books we're looking at or whatever, but it's the way that we search. We all have patterns of searching. We look on the internet in specific ways. And that's the key to prognostication. Prognostication is something that's happening. This whole issue of the future and prognostication is happening through a kind of metadata of algorithms that are being used to understand the way that the brain works, but also to understand how architecture works, also to figure out how the internet and virtual reality works, but also on these search engines. And they are what create these consumer profiles, which are sold to different kinds of companies, corporations, who want to have your attention on the internet. And finally, the financialization of capital, which is really two things. The first is, of course, that the bosses and the worker are investing their money into the same hedge funds, and therefore are both suspect to the vagaries of the market. So that reduces the desire of the worker to strike or to do anything against the company. And of course, herd behavior. The financialization of capital is about the psychic forces in the market, which have become more and more important. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, we've already talked about that, the cognitive turn in cognitive capitalism, which I think is really important for us today. The cognitive turn is made up of three components. One, the focus of capitalism, its direct and indirect action upon the neuroplastic potential of the brain, its population of subjects in the living present, especially not exclusively during what is referred to as the critical periods of development. I share with Catherine Malibu the notion of neuroplasticity as a source of flexibility and docility, as well as liberation and emancipation. Two, secondly, the rules and regulations that created conscripted bodies, referred to as biopower, have now been modified in order to create efficient minds and brains in cognitive capitalism, in which the industrial factory has been replaced by the factory of the mind. This is indirectly related to another phenomenon. As we move from the linear, analog, and extensive conditions of labor in industrial capital To those which are characterized as nonlinear, networked, and intensive, a new face of capital appears. Later on, I will dig deeper into how Taylorism, the scientific exploration elaborated by Charles Taylor to maximize a laborer's output, has given way to what I call hedonism, in which the emphasis is now placed on the elaboration of efficient neural circuits, the result of engineered, repetitive, and synchronous stimulation, which drive new forms of mental and cognitive labor, but also create a sculpted neural architecture. 3. I'm not going to talk about this because it's just impossible. I want to elaborate an additional source of the brain architecture, cultural architectural condition. I want to suggest the neoliberal brain is a socio-political and cultural response directed to the activities and characteristics of the normally operating prefrontal cortex. So what I'm arguing is that as we move from industrial capital to cognitive capitalism, we're also moving from an economy which is more utilizing the capacities of the posterior part of the brain to that which is using the anterior part of the brain, which is the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. And if I was going to go into this discussion, I would show you that the history of the frontal cortex and the evolution of man from primates has been increasingly larger and larger. But that's not today. So what is neuroplasticity? If cognitive capitalism, this later stage, is directed to the brain and is directly related to the brain's neuroplasticity, what is this plasticity? And what is the relationship between ayahuasca and drug taking and later to art production? How is it related, as I will hopefully show, how the ideas of Jacques Rancière, the ideas of the distribution of sensibility, is not only a condition of the cultural landscape, but is also a condition of the materialization of network conditions in the brain. That these two have a relationship. That what's going on in the outside world will sculpt the neuroplasticity of the brain. So again, Catherine Malabou describes plasticity's native land is the field of art. Plasticity characterizes the art of modeling, and in the first dance, the art of sculpture. The plastic arts are those whose central aim is the articulation and development of forms. Among these are counted architecture, drawing, and painting. Neuroplasticity refers to the modulations of neural architectures at both microscopic and molar level, and I'm going to show you these. Both of these happen in the life of the individual. These modulations of the neural substrate are transferred to the next generation as such, although through modifying the built environment and enlisting changes as architecture, for instance, the logics of the neural architecture transmitted. So what I'm saying is that in this, for instance, here we are, and here we are. This is one slide you should try to remember, maybe of all the other things. And this is basically what neuroplasticity is. This is really what sculpting is of the brain. So what happens is that, as the caption says, that on the left is a 17-year-old kitten, 17-day-old kitten, and on the right is an adult cat. So tell me, what do you see? What's the difference between what's on the left and what's on the right? What do you see on the left? Who can raise your hand and tell me what you see on the left? How would you describe it? Is it right? Is it organized or disorganized? Is it like anarchic, or is it really random? And also, there's a lot. It's really full, right? Yes. Anybody else in this discussion? Yes? You see that, right? And this so happens that at 17 days, there's this incredible blooming. The genetics that are organizing the brain and the development of brain, they're communicating to the neurons to go through an explosive growth period. And that's what we're seeing. And it's random. It's not coming. It's not being directed at anything. It's just an effulgence. It's just an outpouring. But on the right, what happens in the adult cat? What's the difference here? What do you see? Come on, tell me what you see. What's the difference? Right, there's an elimination, right? Yes? Come on. Yes? Yes, right? What's that? Deforestation. Beautiful. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. It's deforestation. Yeah, a specific kind of land use, right? Mining, forestry, whatever they use. They don't take all the trees. They only take certain ones because only certain of the trees are good for building houses or whatever their need. They leave certain trees, they take others. This is called pruning or sculpting. What happens is this on the left is a result of the whole evolution of the cat. Every type of species of cat that has ever been, it has to do with all the differences between the mother cat and the father cat. And it also has to do with certain aspects that occur during pregnancy, whether the mother got sick, whether the mother was hungry or had no food. But on the right, what happens is that the cat has a specific Umwelt, a cat Umwelt. The cat has a specific perceptual, cognitive world that it lives in. And because we're talking about the visual cortex here, it has a specific system of semiotic visual signs that have meaning for the cat. And they repeat over and over and over again in the environment, and they're important for the survival of the cat. All the other neurons and neural processes, they have degenerated because they weren't stimulated. Because the brain and the neuron, they feed. They're hungry for stimulation. They need stimulation. Of course, they need glucose, they need ATP, they need all these other things, but they're hungry for stimulation. And they're only hungry for certain kinds of stimulation. And if they're not stimulated over and over again, those that are stimulated over and over again have a selective advantage. That's because this is a method called Darwinism, neural Darwinism. It's based on a theory of neural Darwinism. And it uses the theories of Darwinism that occur with some differences, which I'm going to explain later, in natural habitat, and use that theory to explain how certain of these neurons continue to exist and then proliferate. Because not only are they pruned, but once they're pruned and they become highly engaged and they start emerging, there's certain emergence that it takes place, the bottom-up type of phenomena of their interaction and their interrelationship to each other. So that's what I mean by neuroplasticity. And it's the specific environment of the cat that creates this kind of thing. Human beings, we have like language. Let's talk about language for a minute. There are 6,700 languages on this planet Earth. They're actually decreasing. But right now there are 6,700 languages. What language we learn is not specified. The human being, the baby has no idea what environment, what language environment, because language is like an ecosystem too, but it uses different kinds of sounds, meanings, and grammars. It doesn't know what language it's going to be. It could be a baby born in London, a baby born in Beijing, a baby born in Lima, Peru, or Bogota, or sub-Saharan Africa. It doesn't know. It doesn't know. The brain is unspecified. It has neuroplasticity, though. That's what it has. It has the capacity for the brain to respond in the same way as the cat, to respond to the specific language environment that it's born in, by the consistencies of that environment, by the repetitions of that environment, by the synchronicities of that environment, of that language environment, of the relationships between sign and symbol, of the relationship between what you hear and what you see and what you feel, and what a word means. Then it becomes sculpted, and it becomes a finely tuned machine. It could have learned all the other languages. That's why Japanese people have difficulty learning R's. because their capacity to learn the R has actually been deleted, because in their linguistic environment, that sound very rarely exists. So there's that, and then of course, everyone knows of the relationship between language, thought, and meaning, and how culture and language are intricately entangled with each other. So here we have the tree issue, right here. Here we are. This is a topiary garden. This is a topiary garden where they shape trees, and I'm kind of giving this as a kind of illustration. But it's not only about the visual cortex or just about the senses. It's also about affect and emotion. And the study by Meany, which Sanford is likes very much, this particular right, Sanford, you know Meany's work. You've written a lot about it. There's really two kinds of mothers, believe it or not. There are who lick their babies differently. There are high grooming moms and low grooming moms. Those that lick their babies a lot and those that don't lick their babies a lot. And it turns out that those babies that are licked a lot have a tremendous difference in the length and the number of synaptic bulbs. That's what these are. This is a high intensity micrograph. You see all the bulbs. These are places of interchange and very important for the complexity of the brain. The brain is much more complex in the high licked babies, and their brains are much more complex. They have much more connections, and these connections are manifest in these two pictures here, in which you see the axons extremely long and thick versus thin. And it's just like, what is a complex brain? Why is that important? Let's talk about the difference between like the subway system. Let's say that these axons and these axon systems. You've seen subway maps, metro maps, right? And like, say this is Paris. This is the Parisian subway map, and this is the LA subway map. Now, when you're in Paris, say you're at Odeon, and you want to get to Clangencourt, which is in the north of Paris, or you want to get to Pigalle. When you're in Paris, you have so many ways that you can take so many different subway lines. You could go straight there if you want, but maybe you want to go to the Louvre and hang out a little bit, or maybe you want to go to Montparnasse first. You have all the capacity because the complexity, your ability to think and to understand and to make choices and prognosticate about the future and understand what you might want to do is much more rich in the subway system of Paris, whereas in LA, you're very restricted in how you can go. Now they're building new subway systems in LA, thank God. But you only can go, like right now you can go actually from Santa Monica downtown. You could go from Pasadena, as John knows, downtown. But besides going to Hollywood, it's not that easy, right? You don't have that many possibilities. And that's what the brain, a complex brain is. A brain that the babies that have been licked a lot, high-groomed babies, they have very complex brains. And they, therefore, in situations later in life, when they are under stress, they have other repertoires of behaviors that they can go to. They don't only have to depend on one kind of repertoire. And then look what happens. Selected mothers of one standard deviation, high groomers, or below low groomers, and then look what happens. Because of these complex brains, lower behavioral and hormonal responses to stress. Why? Because they have other possibilities. They can make other choices. They're not limited. Increased, this is a little bit complicated, and I didn't want to go into the mRNA expression in the hippocampus, but the hippocampus is where we have memories. And you have an increased expression of glucocorticosteroid hormones, and decreased corticotropin releasing hormones. These are all kinds of things that are not important. But the fact of the matter is, they have less stress. That's the key. I was talking about plasticity on the molecular level. Let's talk about plasticity on the molar level. And here we have, unfortunately, a young woman who what's something? Hold on. Hold on. We have a young woman who has had an amputation of her right leg, right here, her amputation. And before I go into it, what happens is that this is the brain, and I'm going to be, in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to be discussing what's called the motor cortex. That's the cortex that directs our motor behavior, our actions. And the somatosensory cortex, which is the part of the cortex that senses and receives information from all parts of the skin. It turns out that this somatosensory cortex, if you look here, it's a funny thing called a homunculus. This is great to draw. I mean, if you're an artist, this is great stuff to draw or make sculptures out of. I mean, it's really a lot of fun. And what happens here is you notice that the hand is huge, that the hand on the somatosensory cortex is huge, and that the eye and the mouth and the tongue are huge, whereas the other parts of the body are hardly ever represented. Look at the back and the leg. They're very little, and it's because our hands are so sensitive. Our hands are so sensitive. Our lips are so sensitive. We need very complex cortical representations. That's why the homunculus is the way it looks. It's not built on what part of the body. It's not equally. Everything is not equal in the homunculus. Some areas are expressed more. And look what happens here. This is the other kind of neuroplasticity that I wanted to talk about, and it's called remapping. Here's another person who has lost their arm, their left arm, and what happens is that, remember I told you that neurons need sensation. That's they're hungry for. When they don't have it, they starve, and they have to get the food from somewhere else. So it turns out that the hand is represented on the face. And if you touch that face in those two different locations, different parts of the phantom hand, the hand that's not there anymore, the hand that's been removed, the amputated, they will feel it there. So if you touch the chin, they'll feel it in their phantom thumb. Now why is that? It's because the mouth, look at the homunculus here again. The mouth and the hand and the face are next to each other. There's a remapping of the now defunct hand. The area of the mouth and the tongue and cheek have taken the area of the cortex to keep it alive, but also if you want to think about it from a psychoanalytic point of view, you can, because the memories that are generated need to be there and to be refreshed, and we have to have access to these memories, and if that area was no longer functioning, then we wouldn't be able to bring into our dreams, we wouldn't be able to bring in these ideas in the hand. But whatever position you want to take. I just want to alkaloids is that they accentuate the effect of the DMT by not allowing the chemical to be broken down in its normal fashion. So that's why it doesn't have, when you were mentioning, I think you mentioned this, it doesn't have a really strong psychotic effect by itself, but it's really working with the DMT to keep it in the synapse longer before it gets removed. So here's what they look like. And if you notice, the DMT, which is on the bottom, this is what they call an indole ring. And this old indole ring is, as you see, that serotonin, and you can't see the top of it, but anyway, they share a common structure so that the DMT can go in and take the place of serotonin. It acts as a serotonin agonist. It accentuates the normal properties. It's a super serotonin, in a way. DMT is structurally related to the neurotransmitter serotonin, and like better characterized psychedelics such as LSD and mescaline, binds to the hydroxy hydroxytryptamine 2A receptors in the central nervous system. I have a picture of that. That's what the receptor looks like. It binds to that receptor. Beautiful, right? An artist drew that. Okay, it's structurally related to neuroserotonin and better characterized psychedelic LSD. Mescaline binds to hydroxytryptamine 2A receptors in the central nervous system, where it acts as an agonist. An agonist is as averse to an antagonist. An agonist is something that makes the reaction stronger, and an antagonist, a chemical antagonist, is something that blocks the action of a drug. Studies in humans have shown that when administered parenterally, that means by IV, DMT provokes dramatic modifications in perception, the sense of self and reality that can be very intense but relatively short in duration. It is now widely accepted hypothesis that following ayahuasca ingestion, MAO inhibition brought out by the harmine, given that is more potent than the TH and is present in T in larger amounts than harmaline, prevents the enzymatic degradation of DMT, allowing its absorption. Okay, that's what I told you before. That's why the harmaline doesn't have an effect on its own, but it accentuates the effect of DMT, because it doesn't allow it to be broken down. It also has been speculated that the B-carbolines may contribute to an overall central effects of ayahuasca by blocking brain monoamine oxidase and weakly inhibiting serotonin reuptake, which combined would lead to enhanced neurotransmitters and modulate the effect of DMT. This is weird. Okay. Activation of the 5-HT2A receptor is necessary for the effects of the classic psychedelics like psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, which act as full or partial agonists at this receptor and represent the three main classes of 5-HT agonists, the ergolines, tryptamines, and phenylethylamines, respectively. A very large family of derivatives from these three classes have been developed, and their structural activity relations have been extensively researched. Okay. That's the active site. That's that's the 5-H2 alpha receptor. And then I thought this was also interesting, and this shows the distribution of serotonergic cell bodies and pathways in the rat. I couldn't find one for the human being, unfortunately, but you can see that the key here is an area where I don't see it here, which is called the raphe nuclei. I don't see it here. Well, anyway, it's down in here somewhere. And the raphe nuclei is what is distributed throughout. Maybe they don't have one in a cat. No, they definitely have it in a cat. Anyway, the raphe nuclei is distributed all throughout the whole brain. It's affecting the whole rat's CNS. Serotonin is there, and anywhere there's serotonin, there can be this reaction. Okay, now we're going to start with neural capitalism. Now, before I get into this, does anybody have any questions that, I know we're going to have question and answer period. I'm talking about understanding questions, not interesting theoretical questions, but just, was there anything you didn't understand or you'd like to understand better? Because we're going to have a question and answer period in a few minutes. But just something like that. A quick question, no. Okay, everybody's happy. Okay. So let's go into neural capitalism. Neural capitalism is a component of cognitive capitalism. Cognitive capitalism is the result from the shift of industrial production in Fordism and post-Fordism carried out by the physical labor of the proletariat to the cyber-networked production carried out by the mental laboring of the cognitariat. The phrase cognitariat, or cognitive labor, has been associated with the political philosopher Franco Berardi, who uses it to describe the workers of virtual production, who are the social body of the soul at work in the sphere of semio capital. In post-industrial economies dominated by customized knowledge and service production, and I thought your point, Florence, was very, very good, because it's a kind of capitalistic adventurism that is part of the North and maybe not part of the South. The mind has become the dominant site of capitalistic venturism. Maybe you don't want it. Maybe you're lucky. Anyway, fixed capital, the capital invested in, for instance, machinery, which is slow to change, even if computer models change a little faster, has been exchanged for labile capital of life itself. So here are the components of neural capitalism. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about a few. Big Farm, neurotechnology, and post-human brain, the process of externalization, cortical implants, brain-computer interface, neural dust, the distribution of sensibility, attention economy, Internet of Things, data profiles, cognitive ergonomics, consumer neuroscience, neuroeconomics, neoliberalism of the frontal brain, special effects, trucage, and infotainment, the early and late stages of cognitive capitalism, epigenetic architecture, parametrics, and algorithms. So here we have Big Pharma. I'm only going to go through a few. And Florencia, of course, talked about this already, but here I go. Big Pharma, ADHD. The rise of ADHD diagnosis and prescriptions for stimulants over the years coincided with a remarkably successful two-decade campaign by pharmaceutical companies to publicize the syndrome, promote the pills to doctors, educators, and parents. With the children's market booming, the industry is now employing similar marketing strategies on the adult. Profits for the ADHD drug industry have soared. Sales of stimulant medication in 2012 were nearly $9 billion, more than 5 times the $1.7 billion a decade ago, according to the data company IMS Health. The selling of attention, this is from this article, okay. And then here, the new thing is the selling, here's an advertisement for selling adults. Because adults, you know, I remember being the kid with ADHD. Truth is, I still have it. So the new market is not the young people anymore, but actually the older post-ADD person. Neurotechnology. So that was Big Pharma. So these are what I'm calling neurocapitalism. Because ADHD is very important in modulating the brain, the brain's neurochemistry and its behavior, its part, pharmacology is also part of this kind of neurocapitalism. Ayahuasca, the ayahuasca industry, where the tourist industry surrounding ayahuasca in Peru could also be, in a way, a type of neurocapitalism. I'm not talking about that, but that could also be. But on the other hand, having lots of different people have the possibility to have ayahuasca, and whether it creates economies, I don't think is a bad thing, because it also allows them an awareness that they would not have or not experience otherwise. So here we are in neurotechnology. The first one I want to talk about is DARPA's cortical modem. What is a cortical modem? Quite simply, it is a direct neural interface that will allow for the visual display of information without the use of Google Glasses. The short-term goal of the project is the development of a device about the size of 2 stacked nickels and the cost of $10, which would enable the perception of a simple visual display via direct interface with the visual cortex. And here is a case of the blind can see. And here's an example of a cortical implant. And what I'm arguing is that, although it sounds astounding and amazing, 10 years from now, it may be creating completely fictitious realities, fictitious visual realities in people's minds through feeding them different kinds of information, depending on what the sovereign or the institution wants to. So the possibility for the normalization of the brain's neural materialism or neural capacity could be at stake in all of these things. So then here we have the brain-computer interface. The locked-in syndrome refers to a condition in which a person, while conscious, is almost completely physically paralyzed and is unable to verbally or by movements to make themselves understood. Communication possibilities to the outside world arise mostly through vertical eye movements or measuring the dilation of pupil. Brain-computer interfaces have begun to be used for moving a cursor on a computer screen. This is an incredible, and don't think I'm not in awe of this. I'm completely in awe of these things. However, I understand that there are always negative consequences. You know, I'm so happy that these people are having the chance to interact with the world, but at the same time, I fear what the future could bring with these technologies. So here we have somebody who's locked in, and they have this device that's implanted in their brain, and they can now, and on top of their head, send brain wave patterns to a computer, and they can move a cursor on a screen. And say, for instance, instead of this grid that was on that screen, you see the grid, right? Instead, maybe that was a footprint of a room, and they could just move the cursor to, to make the wheelchair move to a door, or maybe move to a kitchen counter where they could activate different kinds of things. And then, of course, this is, brain actuated computer games are already starting. This was in 2001. They've moved way beyond this. And then this is the computer brain interface that is a mainstay of science fiction. But did you know these devices are available today that you can use your brainwaves as a computer input? How well does it work? Is it practical? How far away is the reality? Remember that stereopticon cards and phenocaliscopes and zoetropes were the mainstay of recreational visualization during the end of the 19th century. And today we're already, we're past cinema, video, virtual reality, and now we're in VR, we're in serious VR. So who knows where these will go? Will this lead to a culture of telepathy, a telepathic culture where we develop the possibilities of telepathic communication, not only with humans but with objects? Because if every object in the Internet of Things has a radio frequency on it, or is tagged and is active, then these devices are now interacting with objects as well as people, and it creates the possibility. Neural dust. What is neural dust? I mean, these things are really scary once you think about it. I think the long-term prospects for neural dust. Here's what neural dust looks like. That's the size of it implanted. It's like a tenth of a millimeter. But I want to show you it. Hold it. The long-term prospects of neural dust are not only within nerves and brains, but much broader. Michael Maharbees, an associate professor of electrical engineering and computer sciences and one of the study's two main authors, having access to in-body telemetry has never been possible because there has been no way to put something super tiny, super deep. But now I can take a speck of nothing and park it next to a nerve, an organ, or a GI tract or muscle and read out the data. So this is like when I was talking about the statisticon. This neural dust is creating data. Then this data, then you have the telemetry, the brain-computer interfaces, creating, linking itself with this Internet of Things. And then you have this possibility of the cortical implants with a whole different alternative visual display. And then we have the statisticon. It's just there. But how do we, what are our possibilities? And now I would like to get into psychedelic art. And I'd like to talk about that because, as Jan Venner, founder of Rolling Stone magazine, put it, the culture wars that began in the 60s about drugs, about military incursions into foreign countries, about sex and human rights, the environment, and so on, are still being fought. All the issues are correct, and they are rooted in activism of the 60s. The values have not been only survived. In many ways, they are mainstream values of our time. And right now in America, we're seeing a battle between those people who would like to pretend the 60s didn't exist and those people who believe in the values and the ideas that manifested from the 60s. And I think drug taking is one of them. Psychedelic, pertaining to the characterized by hallucinations, distortions of perception and awareness, and sometimes psychotic-like behavior. A drug that produces such effects, an art style influenced by the prevalence of hallucinatory drugs, especially LSD, with typical designs featuring abstract swirls of intense color with curvilinear calligraphy reminiscent of Art Nouveau. The name psychedelic refers to drugs that were popular with the youth culture of that time. Posters for rock concerts tried to visually express the feeling of tripping out. Americans in the 1960s and 70s addressed many controversial issues, from civil rights, the Vietnam War, nuclear proliferation and the environment, to drug use, sexual freedom, and nonconformity. Many youth sought spiritual experiences through Eastern mysticism and psychedelic drugs. Many music festivals and concerts were a prominent feature of the 60s landscape, and musicians such as Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, The Who, Janis Joplin were superstars of the day. It is hard to say whether psychedelic music influenced the counterculture or vice versa, but a unique art form found expression in band posters. These were some of the influential designers. Wes Wilson was one of the best-known designers of psychedelic posters, most well-known for designing posters for Bill Graham of the Fillmore East and West. He invented the style that is now synonymous with the peace movement psychedelic era in the 1960s. In particular, he's known for inventing and popularizing a psychedelic font around 1966 that made its letters look like they were moving or melting. And here's one of his posters. These are some of his posters. I don't have the names of them, unfortunately. I put this together really quickly, but you get the idea. These were the psychedelic posters. This is Jefferson Airplane. Then there was another guy named Victor Morosco. Morosco was a formally trained graphic designer who borrowed from comic books, Victorian images, Art Nouveau, and pop art. He used the concept of vibrating colors to create a psychedelic effect in many of his pieces. The vibration is achieved by taking color from the opposite end of the color wheel, each one having equal value and intensity. So some of these posters and some of this art was created by taking drugs and then doing the art, and then some of the posters and some of the art were to be used when you were taking the drugs as a way of creating cool patterns and cool trips. And here's another one. But these designs also influence pop and op art as well as fashion, film, design, and architecture. What I'm arguing here, and this is through all of this neuroscience, neuropharmacology, everything you've seen, what I'm arguing is that through their indirect activity, hallucinogens had a direct and indirect effect on the material of the brain, its neurochemical environment, aesthetic effects in a style of making. So these neurochemical environments, whether they were actually the neurochemical environments of the brain or the neurochemical environments that were part of the world, that were embedded in the world, the sensibilities that were embedded in the world, had aesthetic effects in a style of making. These materializations, and it affected not only art, but everything. And I'm going to show that. Creating new gestalts and affordances. What they did is they contaminated these types of aesthetics, contaminated the aesthetic landscapes and cultural landscapes. And they created new gestalts and affordances that called out to variable populations in new, unforeseen ways. That in the variable nervous system, within the variable nervous system, there was the potential, just like we saw with the cat's brain at that particular time, there was a mass of unorganized, anarchic neurons, just a mass of them. And then the specific cat's Umwelt sculpted particular populations of them, but all the other ones died out. But had there been a different, say for instance, if we took different animals like birds like finches, or we took, I don't know, snakes or whatever, they all had different possibilities. They require different kinds of visual stimulation. Their sculpting would be different. And what I'm arguing is that this kind of mutation of the cultural landscape calls out to a different part of that variable population of neurons in new and unforeseen ways. It's emergent. We don't know how it's going to end up. Sculpting new regularities in the neural pile and consequently affecting the brain's architecture and consequently affecting the mental capacity to think and to activate mental capacities. I'll be done in 5 minutes, 2 minutes. Both its static elements, the array of neurons that created its neural network structure, the so-called hardware, but also the dynamics. So the hardware, the neurons that we saw, the synapses, the dendrites, all that, but also its dynamic relations to the rhythms of the brain, how they communicate in the local area to the global area. And here we have how this type of poster and this kind of mental effects finds its way and contaminates aesthetic production as well. So here's Bridget Riley, A Movement in Squares, Andy Warhol, Shea. And then, of course, in the exhibition in the Rialto, Jesus Ruse Durand. And in fashion. And in book design. And in furniture design. And in architecture and its phantasmagoria. This is Archigram. I should have mentioned that. In conclusion, after all that, okay, in conclusion, Jacques Rancière, in The Politics of Aesthetics, describes the distribution of the sensible or partage du ensemble sensible, excusez-moi, as the implicit law governing the sensible order that parcels out places and forms of participation in a common world by first establishing the modes of perception within which these are inscribed. Implicit in this statement is that sovereignty, the entity, whether absolute or popular, local or global, that has jurisdiction over the territory or group of people, produces a system of perceptual facts that are regulated and in turn regulate its constituents as perceptual bodies, molding them into a concrete and uniform entity. Rancière also includes times and forms of activity in his distribution. In the end, who sees or hears what or decides to move through what space in time designates either their inclusion or exclusion. Oh, shit, did it again. Sorry, I'm not used to IBM. These modes of production perception are not limited to an elaboration of designed urban space where these distributions can become highly activated as part of a branded commercial environment that captures and holds a consumer's attention, but as we shall see shortly, elaborate coupled static and dynamic functional networks in the brain as well. In cognitive capitalism, the transition from the sensorium to the direct sculpting of the neurobiological architecture itself, through the molding of the brain's neuroplasticity as its primary mode of operation that defines its difference from those forms of governmentalization that preceded it in Fordism and post-Fordism. In the contemporary context of cognitive capitalism, fields of engineered distributions of the sensibility are now directly and indirectly bound and entangled within the field of static and dynamic neural networks. The narrative takes this argument one step further and understands it as a collective neural developmental process in which enacted and extended forms of auto-subjectivization are internalized and organized in neurobiological architecture. I would like to make the claim that in our contemporary world, police actions are directed towards the maintenance of these distributions of the world, but also in the brain. The power of art, including poetry, music, film, as well as architecture, is to act upon either of these systems in a disruptive way in order to redistribute the sensibility both in the world and via its implicit and explicit actions on the brain and mind, ultimately emancipating the image of thought itself and understanding. Thank you.